Ms. Johnson, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield for questions?
The gentleman yield for questions.
Yes.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you. Dr. Oliverson, I wanted to recount some of the things that happened in the Public Health Committee. On the day that we heard that committee, there were 2,489 people who registered in support or against. Do you recall that?
I don't.
Will you take my word that it was at a time where I took a photograph of it?
Well, you've never lied to me or given me a reason to think that you would be misrepresenting, so I'll take your word for that.
Thank you very much. And I will say this is a photograph that I took of the screen right about the time that we got done. So it is just my personal recollection of looking at the computer data. And you may recall that I made a statement at some point about how many people were still waiting to testify. The layout in this hearing, witnesses were called up for and against. Do you recall that?
I don't.
Okay. Again,
That was, and I would just point out, just for, I'm not trying to be effusive here about it or whatever, but what I'm getting at is that we heard this bill, I think, in March.
We did, and I recall that we had invited testimony. We had limited invited testimony. And I recall that the chair would call one person who was testifying in favor of the bill and then would call another person who was testifying against the bill. Do you recall that? I see Chairwoman Click nodding her head.
I think that's right, and I just want to add, if I may, that I think the other thing I recall in the testimony is that the members had a tremendous amount of questions, and there were some very good conversations that were had. So I remember there being a robust dialogue considering essentially all the points of view on this, and really a very robust back and forth by both sides.
And we started that hearing. We had a number of bills in the morning. We got to our topic around the afternoon, and the testimony was cut off at midnight, which was at the chair's discretion, and she made her statement early about that. My point being, there were 84 people who were in favor of your bill, and there were 2,401 people against your bill. But if you go back and watch that tape, it looks like it's a one-to-one comparison in the manner that the witnesses were called, but it was actually about a 24-to-1 comparison of folks that were actually giving a position on your legislation. Do you recall that?
I don't.
Okay. Would you agree with me that the witnesses that you called as invited testimony, a significant number of them were from outside the state of Texas?
I remember that the witnesses that we invited were national experts on this issue.
And one of those experts is from a conservative think tank out of the Northeast, correct?
I'm not advised.
You were sitting there when he testified.
Okay.
You recall?
I mean, I remember the
witness.
people that came and testified, but
this was your invited witness, right?
Sure, yeah.
My office is next to your office, so when I walked by your office, I could see these people waiting in your effective waiting area.
Representative, all I can tell you is that we were very thoughtful and careful about the people that we invited. We sought out experts, people who have written about, studied, analyzed the research, done extensive reviews, and were very knowledgeable. And those are the people that we sought to bring.
The gentleman's time's expired.
Mr. Speaker, may the gentleman's time be extended.
Members heard the motion. Objection. The chair hears none. So ordered.
One of the physicians that you had, we had the dialogue about the fact that he had previously been discredited in a Texas court as not being an expert in this field. Do you recall that?
I don't, but I will tell you that I was disappointed that instead of focusing on the actual testimony for several of our witnesses, it seemed that we were more interested in character assassination.
Credibility and expertise.
Well, I would also submit to you that he was the only pediatric endocrinologist that testified
is the character we should have looked at and who came in. That is the precise question.
I don't recall, I may be wrong, maybe you can correct me, I don't recall any pediatric endocrinologists coming to testify at the House hearing in support of this bill. In opposed to this bill. I remember one pediatric endocrinologist that testified, and that's the gentleman whose character you're impugning.
The gentleman who has been disqualified by a Texas court on this very issue as not an expert. That's just a fact. We heard from a number of other physicians. We heard from a number of other medical professionals and associations that did not agree with your position.
And we're
my
not
point
subspecialty experts in this field.
And you aren't either.
I did not represent myself to be, which is why we brought in experts who were.
And I recognize that you are a physician, and I recognize that you get called Dr. Oliverson every time you come there, but you're not standing there in a white coat today, correct?
I think, Representative, that I think I'm not a pediatric endocrinologist, which is why I brought one with me. I would point out that this opposition brought no pediatric endocrinologist to testify.
We did bring a physician that has treated these individuals and is an endocrinologist.
Who is not board certified in pediatric endocrinology. And she actually testified to that fact.
Dr. Colt also testified.
Dr. Colt was also not a pediatric endocrinologist.
But does practice pediatrics.
Well, I mean, again, I think if we want to have a conversation about, I'm a doctor, but you're saying I'm not qualified because I'm just a doctor, I'm just putting that back to you and saying that the experts, if you really want to have that conversation, the experts in the room are the pediatric endocrinologists. There was only one that came to testify.
And my point being, you are an anesthesiologist, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you are not here today, even though we deservingly call you doctor and that is your title. But you are not here as a physician representing a medical association or community. You are here as a politician.
I'm here as a member of this body, the same as you, Representative. And just as we often come to you on questions that are your area of expertise, people often come to me on questions that have to do with medical expertise.
But you just recognized you being a medical professional does not make you an expert in this particular area.
And that's why we had testimony from medical experts.
And
that's why we brought pediatric endocrinology.
Agree or not, we heard testimony from both
We did.
positions.
We absolutely did, but we only heard from one doctor who actually subspecializes in this area.
And we probably could have done this hearing for days because we had 450 people that were waiting to actually be heard on this issue. So if we had let this play out and hear all the testimony of those that wanted to come, we may have gotten a chance to hear from all those other individuals, but they were not invited by you. Correct?
Representative, we had an equal number of invited witnesses per the chairwoman's instructions, followed by public testimony, and I can't comment any more about that. I mean, those are the rules that I was given, and that there would be fair and equal representation of experts on both sides.
And I want to talk about the individuals that came saying that they are in the process of detransitioning. If I recall, and you and I heard them twice. We heard them in both public health and in insurance. And what I recall about those individuals is that they had not gone through any procedures under the age of 18, correct?
I think their testimony and the story that they brought spoke more to the issue of the risks and the side effects and the lifelong complications that come from these treatments, which are often minimized by those who advocate for these procedures.
And so you and I agree,
because
we've had this conversation.
I would point out that, they are in the unfortunate position of essentially being shunned by their own community because their very existence essentially invalidates gender-affirming care.
So I had a nice moment with Karina in insurance. You recall that, right?
Yeah.
Did you think that we did not understand each other?
I didn't say that you didn't understand each other, Representative. What I said is that the detransitioners' life experiences, which neither you nor I could ever relate to in terms of what they're living with on a daily basis, have gone largely unnoticed.
And those individuals that came to testify, as you mentioned earlier, your invited credentials were national folks who are going around testifying on this issue, but they are not from Texas. There was only one from Texas, right?
Well, I mean, it might surprise you, but this issue is a hot topic around the world right now. So what we intended to do was seek out the most experienced and most, well, in the scientific literature, it's a hot topic too.
It's a hot topic in scientific literature in both respects. This is a hot political topic here. What concerns me is the families that we didn't hear from are actual Texans. They are the families that will be forced to leave this state having to choose between loving and caring for their child or being in compliance with your position on this issue.
Well, and I
So-
think that's the evidence that the body has to weigh in this bill, is whether we believe, just like the opioid pandemic,
Great.
that the greater good
Would you tell me
is
in what year
protecting
you
children
banned
from these
opioids?
experimental therapies.
Would you tell me in what year you proposed legislation to ban opioids?
We did not ban opioids.
You didn't. You
but
created-
we regulated the practice of
You sure did.
prescribing
You
them.
regulated the practice.
So what
and
we
here,
did,
we
that's-
could regulate the practice, couldn't we? We don't have to ban it.
So,
We could regulate the practice. We don't have to ban it.
yeah, so...
We could. I know you're not going to, but we could.
So-
just like we did with opioids, right?
We can do any manner of things, Representative, but the bill before us
Doesn't do
is
that.
exactly what the state needs to do.
Correct. In your opinion, your bill does not allow,
That is my assessment, and that is the bill I'm offering to
but
the
I want to
body.
make sure it's very clear that this state could do something different and could create a group or a study or a position of evaluating,
I
correct?
think we could do any manner of things, Representative, but
This
the
is what you're
evidence
choosing.
points that this is the correct direction
Can
to
you
go.
tell me, because I was very moved, and when you said it, man, you got me. Because I remember a family friend who had a lobotomy, and you got me. So tell me what year you banned lobotomies in Texas.
I'm not advised, Representative.
Because you haven't done it. It's not illegal. It's not occurring very much anymore because medical science evolved and figured it out.
Yep.
And that's all we're asking.
For decades,
Is don't ban,
there were people
because
in
you haven't
mental
banned
hospitals
anybody other
that were
than
unable
this
to even
population
recognize who they
of
were or where
Texans.
they were, that were harmed. But yes, I
And
get it.
you didn't step in on that.
Well,
but
I
you're
wasn't in the
stepping on top
legislature
of these
then.
families.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Gonzalez,
Does
board
the gentleman
members.
yield?